Good morning, everyone. We're now moving to panel number 2. If we were not scared enough until now, you will be in this panel. Hello. And so it's the future ahead of us. We have Dr. Robert Steger from Innsbruck. He is 8 hours behind us. So we will start with him and then have Q&A. And then Dr. Michelle Rutti, MA Proviano, who is also an ABD, will actually show us what the future could look like. Robert, up to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Federica. Hello, everyone from Austria. And I'm happy to be here with you to give a short presentation. And thank you for the invitation to give a talk at this conference. I would have preferred to be there in person and do some, field work, field research on the ski fields. But yeah, however, maybe there's an opportunity next time. So I will give a presentation on climate change, the Winter Olympics, and the sustainability of snowmaking. And I'm also here on behalf of my colleagues of the University of Waterloo. So Michelle Rutti was also contributing to that research, but she will be here later on. And also Daniel Scott was involved in all of this research. So I'm also here on behalf of my colleagues. I'd like to start with the Winter Olympics. You have already discussed a little bit about potential mega events related to winter sports. So we were focusing in some publications in the last years on the Winter Olympics, because when looking at the Olympics, we see that the success of the Games is often partially, at least, attributed to favorable weather, while poor weather is highlighted as one of the greatest challenges faced by the organizing committees. And those committees and the sporting federations and also the IOC, they have continually developed and refined their strategies to reduce the risk of adverse weather. For example, as you can see here on the slides, hockey moved indoors in the 1950s in the Oslo Games. Also, the movement and compaction of snow was done manually with the assistance of military personnel or volunteers, for example, in the 60s in Innsbruck in Austria. Or bobsled used to be held on natural luge tracks. Later on, concrete luge tracks were built and used, and again later were also refrigerated to be more reliable in the changing climate and also to be more reliable in an ever-growing mega event. During the Vancouver and Sochi Games in the some decade ago, several athletes from several countries raised serious concerns about the fairness and also the safety and conditions. For example, you see here the quote by Lara Gut and a Super G racer who said, "There is no snow at the bottom. It's not funny anymore. It was a shame for everybody, and it's not a race. You're just trying to come down." And there were complaints about too soft snow reducing the speed, which makes it more difficult and also more dangerous for the skiing cross, for example, and other events. And Vancouver experienced its warmest February in recorded history during the Olympics, forcing the Olympic Committee to continuously adapt and improvise. And both the Sochi and the Vancouver Games were plagued with countless interruptions due to suboptimal conditions, so to say, and also delays, including several postponements in alpine skiing during those games. Now, when looking at the climate conditions for the Olympic Winter Games, we analyzed average daytime temperature in February, where Olympic Winter Games are usually held in the first 3 weeks of February or so. And when looking at the 1920s to 50s, you see that the average temperature in the host cities and the snow competition sites were very similar, mainly because due to the fact that in most of those locations where the games were held, the finish line of the alpine ski races was more or less in the host city or near the host city, for example, Chamonix in France or St. Moritz in Switzerland. The host city the stadium was at the same altitude as the ski races took place, and also the Nordic races took place. Looking at the next period, the 60s to the 90s, something has changed. As you can see, the temperature in host cities has warmed, or warmer host cities have been chosen for the Olympic Winter Games, but the snow competition sites were similar in temperature compared to the period before. This means, or this shows, that warmer host cities were selected, maybe also due to the fact that the number of athletes increased, the number of spectators, and also the number of the press staff and the coaches and so on increased. It became bigger, and therefore larger cities were selected for hosting the games due to capacity issues. And usually larger cities are at lower altitude and not somewhere on a mountain pass. They're usually at the valley bottom, and therefore it's warmer in those host cities. But the competition sites were still in a temperature range that was similar to the 20s to 50s. However, when looking at the last period, so this is the 2000s, including also the 2020 games, you see that we again had an increase in temperature in the host cities, but now also in the snow competition sites. And here, again, it's the same reason. The games were again given to warmer cities than in the past. For example, Vancouver, Sochi, and also some others at lower altitude, lower latitude, meaning there is a warmer climate. And also the snow competition sites now were considerably warmer than in past Olympic Winter Games. So here we actually always looked at the finish line of the alpine ski races where we analyzed that temperature. And we also see now some effect of climate change. There is actually two reasons for that. One reason is the games were given to warmer locations, to lower elevated locations. And the second reason is that climate has warmed by about 1.5 degrees since the beginning of the century in mountain regions. Now, how could it look like in the future? Here, a projection on how future warming will impact, or will accelerate under current policy scenarios. What you see here now is different potential emission futures. You know, this is the different colors you see here, the different bandwidths, and each of that color is a certain family or emission type, you could say. The blue one is an extremely optimistic scenario that would be a very, very optimistic climate protection scenario, which is called SSP1 1.9 here. Also, the next one, the SSP1 2.6, is also quite optimistic in terms of climate protection. But when looking to the literature, we see that both of those scenarios are virtually unrealistic from today's point of view to be achieved within the next decade. So it seems that it's not any more realistic to achieve those goals. The other scenarios are still realistic. You see the one to the right, to the very right, is a business as usual scenario. So we do not do anything about climate change or climate change protection, mitigation measures. If we continue to be on the current trajectory, including current climate protection pledges made by the nations worldwide, we would end up somewhere in the so-called SSP3 7.0 warming, so the second one to the right, where we would have a warming until the year 2050 of 1.8 degrees up to 2.8 degrees, depending on which climate models you look at. And up to now, we already, as said, we had something like 1.5 degree warming in mountain regions. So we would experience the same rate of warming or amount of warming within the next 2 decades. And the question is, what would that do with the Olympic Winter Games, or in general with winter and snow sports? So this is why we looked at how to be able to analyze that specific question. And we used 2 indicators to assess whether former host locations of the Winter Olympics would still be climatically reliable to also host the Winter Olympics in a future climate. We had one indicator where we looked at thermal conditions because, as said before, athletes were concerned about suboptimal conditions on the snow and also ice surfaces. And we defined the freezing point as a threshold. If the temperature is not below freezing point during night, the snow and ice surfaces cannot refreeze. and therefore are soft or could be soft during the competitions, which makes it more dangerous for athletes to compete on the slope. And we defined a 90% probability of being below freezing temperature as climatically reliable. The second indicator then was focusing on snow reliability. So the question, is there sufficient snow depth to be able to hold snow competitions like alpine skiing and also Nordic skiing? And we define a snow depth of 30 centimeters with advanced snowmaking technology as a threshold here. And again, more than 90% probability, or to put the other way around, a risk below 10% occurrence that 30 centimeters are not achieved in that location. Now, here are the results on 21 former Winter Olympic host locations. You can see for the 2050s, we distinguish between a low emission scenario, so climatically optimistic, and a high emission scenario, pessimistic scenario. And you can see that in the 2050s, we would expect 12 or 13 out of 21 hosts being climatically reliable. These are the green torches. However, in the late century, in the 2080s, there would be 12 reliable hosts on the globe when looking at the low emission scenario, but only 8 reliable hosts when looking at the high emission scenario. So we would see a remarkable decline of climatically reliable host locations for the Winter Olympic Games. We also had a look at the Paralympic Games that are usually held after the Olympic Games in March, and here the future looks even worse. You can see that the number is even lower than for the Olympic Winter Games, and you see about half of the competition sites can be considered climatically reliable in the baseline climate, so in 1981 to 2010. Less than half of the locations is reliable in the 2050s, and only 4 to 8 are reliable in the 2080s. And this means climate change seems to be a challenge for competition, for mega events like the Winter Olympics. Now, in what way could that impact the IOC and also Olympic committees? Here an example of media reports of last year. The IOC postponed their decision on the 2030 Winter Games host selection by 1 year, citing climate change as the reason to postpone that decision. And this year, the IOC announced that only 10 countries will be able to host snow sports by the middle of the century due to the impact of climate change. So it seems that climate change will impact the selection of future host locations by the IOC. By the way, they asked for a study to analyze about 90 locations, potential future host locations for the Olympics. And as communicated here, it seems that they include these projections on which locations to select for the future. Now, one question that is attached actually to the question, will we still be able to host the Winter Olympic Games in certain locations, or would we still be able to have skiing tourism in certain locations? Attached to that is the question about the sustainability of snowmaking, and or if snowmaking is or can be an adaptation or maladaptation to climate change. Some of the comments beforehand already were directing somehow in that direction. So we see that several scientific publications have suggested that snowmaking represents a maladaptation to climate change, as you use water and also energy to combat the impacts of climate change. But by using energy, you also contribute to climate change. So it's somehow a paradox using snowmaking to combat climate change. But when also looking into the literature, it's also discussed that snowmaking is highly place context specific, varying at the individual operator and also regional market scales, representing a continuum from potential successful and sustainable maybe adaptation to maladaptation. And this was a motivation to do study the first national analysis on snowmaking's environmental sustainability as an adaptation strategy to climate change. And the study was conducted in Canada, in the Canadian markets. So what we did is we used available data on water and energy requirements in Canada for snowmaking, and ran a snow model for 136 ski areas in Canada that represented about 90% of existing ski slopes. So we argue that that study is representative of ski areas in Canada. And as you can see here, we found different indicators, different numbers in the literature concerning the water use per cubic meter of snow or acre foot of snow, and also different measures, different numbers on the energy use, kilowatt hours per produced volume of snow. And as there's quite a large bandwidth, as you can see, we defined the best values as being an efficient snowmaking technology. The worst values were defined as inefficient. And then we also defined a so-called central estimate. And then we calculated potential water and energy use based on these estimates from efficient to inefficient. Now, looking at water use of snowmaking in Canada, you can see here now the volume of water that is required for all ski areas in Canada on the ski slopes that are already equipped with snowmaking. And it sums up to 43 million cubic meters of water annually. And that equals about 17,300 Olympic-sized swimming pools. And you can see by the increasing colors or increasing graph here, that about until the year 2050, an increase of 50 to 100%. So in the worst case, a doubling of required water volumes is required in a changing climate until the 2050s. However, assuming that all ski areas invested in water efficiency measures, installing the newest available technologies, and assuming that nowadays all ski areas had central estimates or an average snowmaking system, that would mean that if all ski areas invested, we would see a lower increase of water requirements by 4% in the climate optimistic scenario, and by 23% in a business as usual in a pessimistic scenario. So you can see that technological improvements could balance somehow the increasing water demand that comes with climate change. Now, the same analysis for the energy use, as you can see here today, about 478,000 megawatt hours are required annually for snowmaking in Canada, and that equals about 43,000 Canadian homes. And again, the same calculation, if all snowmaking infrastructure in Canada would be upgraded to a high energy efficiency by the year 2050, energy consumption could be 16% less compared to today, or up to 9% more in a pessimistic scenario than today's energy consumption, despite large increases in snowmaking requirements, as you have seen before. And to even go one step further, we also calculated the related CO2 emissions related to snowmaking, which totals 130,000 tons of CO2, which equals about the per capita emissions of 8,500 Canadians. And when looking at the lower bar in the baseline, you see a very large yellow part of the bar, and this is actually the emissions of snowmaking in the province of Alberta. And you see the other colors, which are quite small. These are the other provinces, British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec. And the reason is that the electric grid in Alberta is quite dirty, you could say, or the share of fossil fuels in energy production is quite high. So oil or coal or gas-powered power plants, whereas in British Columbia or also in Quebec, Ontario, the share of renewables is quite high. In Quebec, it's more than 90%. And therefore, of course, the related emissions are much lower compared to Alberta. And what you see here is that the numbers are much smaller in the future climate. This is because we had a look at the planned decarbonization of the electric grid in Canada. So there are plans to reduce CO2 emissions that are within the electric grid by the year 2030 and also by the year 2050. And assuming that these goals will be achieved by the government, you can see that then the emissions would, of course, be dramatically reduced by about 96% if those goals would be achieved. Of course, we do not know when and if those goals will be achieved or to what extent, but assuming those goals would be achieved, you would see emissions being much, much lower compared to today, although we would need more snowmaking. So to conclude, as you have seen, climate change will impact the selection of future host locations for the Winter Olympic Games. It will also increase the resource use of snowmaking in the future, also meaning that snowmaking will become more expensive for ski areas. And the question then is, who will pay for those increasing costs? Some of those regions we looked at are also key agricultural areas. And for example, British Columbia is quite reliant on hydropower, which may portend future water conflicts. So there might be questions: who is allowed to use which amounts of water? Is it the ski resort? Is it agriculture? Or is it hydropower, the hydropower company? So ski areas may encounter more strict regulatory constraints in the future. Also, on the other hand, a positive aspect, snowmaking reservoirs may support wildfire response in regions that are becoming warmer and drier. We have seen such incidents in the past in the US and also in Canada. In some locations where we had snowmaking systems, some wildfires could be fighted against, and that was successful, some wildfires on the mountain due to the snowmaking or the water reservoirs they have on the mountain. And if snowmaking was not maintained and the diminished ski season and ski conditions in Eastern Canada, for example, for skiers to travel to ski elsewhere, for example, go to Western Canada, the related emissions would increase dramatically, of course. So we cannot assume that if a ski area closes in Eastern Canada, that their customers say, okay, then we stop skiing and that's it. We have to assume that at least a certain share of those skiers is still wanting to ski, and they would just go somewhere else where it's possible to ski. And in the worst case, they step onto the plane and fly out west, for example, to Whistler. And for example, if only 65 people decided to fly a round trip from Montreal to Vancouver to ski at nearby Whistler Resort, they would be responsible for a similar amount of emissions as Quebec's current entire provincial snowmaking is responsible for. So it's important to have a look at the entire tourism system emissions when talking about adaptation or maladaptation of climate change and sustainability of snowmaking related to climate change. And with that, I'd like to conclude, and I'm now curious and open for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have the first question. Thank you for your insight on the matter. Coming from Italy, I have two questions. Does that decision by the OAC to include climate change in the selection process comes out of huge critics if received after the Winter Olympics held in Beijing? For the Chinese authorities was the greenest edition, but in reality, it has built a ski resort in the middle of a nature reserve and had to blast the snowmaking process since the two sites skiing for competition were enough snow. Second question, your opinion, are the 2026 Winter Olympics hosted in Milano Cortina set to be sustainable?
Difficult question. So maybe to answer or to try to answer the first question. So I have to admit, I do not know what the internal reasons in the IOC are to go in that direction. I can say that we conducted several studies in the last year, so they were interested in learning or knowing more about climate change impacts on Winter Olympic host locations. And I assume that the experience with Vancouver and especially Sochi kind of motivated them to look into that more detailed, because it's just not good news and good pictures that are produced if you have a mega event, maybe in a green landscape with these white strips in the landscape. And we have also seen that there were quite critical media reports concerning the games in Beijing, concerning sustainability and also the ecological aspects of sustainability, especially. And I know that there's also a sustainability group in the IOC, and they have developed a scheme or a classification scheme to assess the sustainability of potential host locations. For example, what share of venues or stadiums are already existing in the area, and they are discussing to only select host locations where there's already a high share of venues available, so that nothing or not as much has to be newly built as in the past in past locations. And the second question for Cortina, I honestly don't know. I have seen that they want to have sustainable games. I have not seen the plans yet. I think there's some potential, of course, as only compared to other venues, not so many new ski slopes and also new stadiums have to be built. So in that sense, I think it can be more sustainable than past games, but we would have to look more into detail into that.
All right, so here we are with the second part of the of our second panel, and we're gonna go into the future with Maeve Rubiano.
So what we have seen in research is how the ski resort industry is changing, but also what we wanted to pair it with is the demand side. So what's the perception of the skiers going to these places? So what we've been developing is a 360 model of how it would look like the snow in terms of snowmaking and how much snow participants will be willing to accept in a ski resort. So this one is a 360 video. If you want later, I can show you in a VR headset. But it's based on Blue Mountain Resort, which is like the biggest one in Ontario and where the snowmaking is happening right now. And the idea is to ask skiers and participants to the sport what are they willing to accept in terms of the amount of snow. And that will be paired as well with proudness, because if you have lower slopes available with snow, then more skiers will go there. So it's a continuation of what Michelle is going to show you, but we can model this with actual height maps and how the actual resorts look like. And that's how we want to pursue research now and in the future.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. The joys of technology, the joys of Zoom. But I'm grateful to be here. Thank you for the invitation, Fed, and thank you for hosting such an important topic today. So good afternoon from Canada, from the University of Waterloo. And before I begin in the spirit of reconciliation, I'd like to acknowledge that my office here at the University of Waterloo is situated on land within the Haldimand Tract, which is land that's promised to the Six Nations. And through this land acknowledgement, I recognize that my research, including the work completed across Canadian mountain communities, is directly related to the continued disposition of Indigenous peoples and the occupation of their land. So given sort of the topic, I know I don't need to belabor at this point because many of you in the audience are clearly very passionate and well aware of our current situation. But it's important to note that while we know climate change is happening, that it's unequivocal, there was a special report done in the high mountain areas that really sort of underscores that our alpine areas are canaries in the coal mine. It's where we're going to see climate change happening at a faster rate than sort of the global mean. And so snow cover, glaciers, and permafrost are projected to continue to decline in almost all regions throughout the 21st century. And so what's particularly important when we think about the impacts of climate change on the ski industry, Robert spoke to this also, but when we talk about how we project impacts on the industry, whether it's ski operators or how people are going to respond to that change, it ultimately depends on sort of what climate future we're looking at. So the risks and the impacts are going to depend on the policies that we as a society pursue. And so Auden has also talked about the importance of working towards sort of reaching that Paris Agreement policy target of temperatures less than 2 degrees Celsius But the reality is, like Robert has said, that we sort of are on trajectory for sort of that blue or that red line, so warming of 3 to 4 degrees Celsius. And in a recent survey by IPCC climate scientists, you can see that over half of us believe that the world will warm by at least 3 degrees Celsius. And so it's not highlighting this in terms of doom or gloom. Really, sort of my key purpose in highlighting it is that we need to adapt. We are changing. The changes due to past and future greenhouse gas emissions are irreversible for centuries to millennia. So we need to be looking at what is coming down the pipeline because we have committed ourselves to that future. So if we were to look at sort of what the impacts or what the risks are, ultimately it often depends on who you're talking to and sort of what resources you're reading. And so when we think about the ski industry, it's widely talked about, widely acknowledged in the media, sort of this doom and gloom narrative, this idea that ski tourism is vanishing. And so these headlines come up every winter, sort of this idea of love skiing, enjoy it while it lasts, climate change is killing alpine skiing, and Alberta ski resorts feeling the effects of dramatic winter weather changes. And this is across all major ski markets. It's not just in Canada and the United States. Of course, we're seeing this in other major markets overseas too. But when we look into these media headlines and we look at where this sort of narrative is coming from, oftentimes they're based on studies that have no sort of scientific, robust research behind it. And so a lot of the work that myself and Robert and Dan Scott and the team that we all work with, we really want to have these climate impacts sort of based on sound science. And Robert and Dan very much focus on sort of operator impacts, and much of my passion lies in understanding the demand side. How are skiers and athletes responding to these environmental changes? So I said that we need to look at sort of the robust science sort of behind it. Who are the scholars who are looking at this? And Robert and his team did a critical review of sort of all scientific publications on climate change and skiing. And as you can see, we've had sort of a rapid increase in the number of publications over time, but it still is rather small in the context of sort of climate change research. But so we've had 119 publications to date. And there's widespread agreement across all of these studies that we're expecting sort of shortened and more variable ski seasons, increased snowmaking requirements with fewer opportunities to make snow, market contraction, and altered competitiveness. And sort of as we spoke about earlier this morning, we already see some of these changes happening when we look at the historical context of the US market. But importantly on this graph, you can see that most of the research is what's highlighted there in orange. And so that's impact and vulnerability assessments. So that's looking at how likely ski resorts are to continue operating. And as I mentioned, I'm particularly interested in how skiers respond to market contraction, to marginal conditions, to having to travel further distances. And if you look on the graph there, it's highlighted in gray, and it's a very small portion. In fact, it's the smallest amount of researchers in this space. There's only 13 papers to date that have sort of looked at how skiers respond to this. And so many of those papers have come from my team, and it's really sort of what I hope we continue to do more research about. So in terms of what we know, as I said, research in this space predominantly explores at what I would call climate thresholds for society. So this idea that we define what threshold changes and then we assume that behavior will react accordingly. So we see it with the Olympic Games. For example, there's an assumption that if the temperatures get too warm, then that host location can no longer have a successful games. And that's like a really deterministic way of thinking. We're starting to see more, and it's exciting to see even the dialogue happening in the room so far this morning, that we need to shift the way we're thinking about this. We need to look at how human or skier thresholds, what are those in terms of climate? We can produce snow. The question is, should we produce snow, or why are we producing snow, or what impacts do we have by creating these sort of artificial landscapes? So it's really not, can we have skiing? It's more a question of, should we or ought we, or what does that look like moving forward? So one way that we can look at how skiers have responded to warm conditions in the past, and we saw that really great study presented earlier by Pau, is we can look at sort of record warm conditions and how have people, whether it's the industry or skiers, how do they respond to those warm winters? And as you can see in this study done in Ontario, the ski season in our record warm season in Ontario, the ski season shortened by 17%. There were a lot fewer lifts operating, less than 50%, sort of early season in that really critical sort of Christmas market. But even though we saw those huge declines in sort of an operational threshold, in terms of how skiers responded, they still kept going. It was a 10% decline, and that mirrors what was presented in the US market. It tends to be about 10% drop out of skiing during those record warm years. And so it tells us that climate isn't the whole story. We can't just look at warming conditions and less snow and assume that we know how skiers are going to respond. And so in that top table, you can look at the projected, the column that says projected. Those are studies that have modeled how climate change is going to impact ski resorts. And so you can see the models have projected anywhere from a 30 up to a 70% decline in skiing. But when we've had record warm winters, the demand doesn't decline near as much as what models project. So again, it's this idea that we can't simply look at climate in order to understand how skiers are going to respond. And as passionate skiers in this room, this probably makes intuitive sense to all of us. What we see is that demand is highly resilient. Skiers are willing to accommodate when we are having poor conditions. And so when we think about how people accommodate, it can be something called spatial substitution. So if your resort isn't open, you'll travel somewhere else to go skiing. It can be temporal substitution. So your resort might have a shorter season. So it just means you'll go more often in that shorter season to make up for time. And then the last type of substitution is called activity. So that means you opt not to go skiing and instead to participate in something else. And skiers don't really do that. They tend to do a lot more spatial substitution, which you can see in this graph here. So where all of those lines are going towards, they're all headed towards Blue Mountain. And so Blue Mountain Resort is our largest resort here in Ontario. And so they are arguably going to be called what we call a climate change winner. A winner in the sense that as those other markets perhaps struggle because they're at lower elevation, have less investment in snowmaking or less investment in sort of village activities, so things other than skiing, you see people willing to travel that distance in order to continue engaging in the sport. And so we have to understand that behavioral shift if we're really going to understand what impact climate change will have on markets. So following up on that study, this graph can be overwhelming. So what I want you to sort of pay attention to is strictly the colors. So spatial substitution, as I said, those are people who will travel somewhere else if their resort is closed. And you can see that is the option that most skiers select. If their resort is either closed today because of poor conditions or would be closed permanently, they'll simply travel somewhere else to continue in the sport. So more than half of our respondents pick spatial substitution. Temporal, as I said, that's shifting the timing in which you'll go skiing. That is, again, that makes up the majority of how people will respond, and very few people will opt out of skiing as a result of poor climate conditions. The other thing to look at on this figure is you can see that skiers aren't homogeneous. So how they respond varies based off how old they are, their level of experience. So for example, experienced or high highly loyal, committed skiers are the most likely to travel to continue in the sport versus our beginner market. They're more likely to have, for example, an activity substitution. And same thing with resort type. So here in Ontario, we have several small sort of feeder resorts, and then we also have private ones. And you can see that people respond differently depending on the type of resort they typically ski at. So again, all of this painting this picture that this idea that a whole industry will collapse, that all skiers are going to stop skiing, is just not realistic. What we really don't know a lot about, and where we need a lot more research, is the possibility that skiers may become intolerant. So in our studies, we get the sense that they're willing to substitute spatially or temporally, but these are to one-off record warm conditions. But what happens when we have 4 or 5 record warm seasons in a row? Are they going to remain as tolerant and willing to sort of travel really long distances over a large number of years? When we think about sort of those resort winners, or those ones where people are willing to travel to because they are more climatically viable, we'll see more crowding. Will skiers become more intolerant of crowding? Will that become problematic over time? So maybe you're willing to wait in a long lift line every now and then, but if that becomes the new norm, will you continue? And if you'll recall, it's that sort of beginner market that's most sensitive to some of these changes. So if we lose our beginner market, we don't sort of get that movement through the ski system from beginner skiers to expert skiers who are more resilient and are more willing to adapt to conditions perhaps that aren't as ideal. So we need to do a lot more sort of research in this space to sort of understand this evolution of demand over time. So Robert presented on this already, but we did a study that looked at sort of the history of the Olympic Games and how they have adapted over time. And you can see that they're hosting them in warmer locations. As Fed has mentioned several times, Saudi Arabia has won the bid to host the Winter Games, sort of the first desert destination. And I bring these to your attention in a different way than what Robert did, in the sense of, I believe skiing can continue forever if that's what we choose to do. If this is how we choose to invest our money, our resources, our energy, our water, we can. So the question perhaps should we continue with skiing as opposed to can we? So that sort of media narrative of the industry is going to collapse, I don't foresee that happening so long as a society we agree that it's something we want to pursue. And so sort of the social justice questions around this are particularly interesting to me. So we looked at all of the history of the Olympic Games to look at how sort of they've adapted over time. And again, there's like this huge arsenal that we can employ that allow the games to continue to be hosted in now desert locations. So again, we know we can host them, but why are we hosting them? And should we host them? And as we were doing these studies, to me, my heart kept being like, well, what about the athletes? Isn't the purpose of the Olympic Games to think about the athletes? So yes, we can produce snow. Yes, we can host the Olympics in desert locations, but should we? And what does this mean for the athletes? And so when the Sochi Games came out, the media there was lots of quotes coming out where athletes were really speaking out about how the conditions were unfair, they were unsafe. Why are we hosting these games? Who are they truly for? And again, it just continued to make me want to sort of understand what their thresholds are for competing. So we were fortunate enough, Dan and I and Robert, to work with a PhD student, Natalie Knowles, who is a competitive skier. And so through her network, we were able to get over 300 elite level athletes to participate in our survey. So these are athletes and coaches who have been to the Olympic Games or have skied at World Cups. And as you can see, when we ask them sort of incidences of these things occurring in their games, you can see that more often now when they're competing, they're seeing higher levels of narrow snow, of wet snow, more rain, and unacceptable temperatures. So it's aligning with, as host cities are getting warmer, we're starting to see that athletes and coaches are similarly recognizing sort of these higher incidences of unsafe or unfair conditions. This speaks to what Auden was talking about the role of sort of athletes and coaches in climate policy and as being climate advocates. And while 94% of our athletes and coaches agreed that climate change was impacting their sport, over 90% also felt that they were personally responsible for engaging in climate action. And so I think there's a really unique opportunity within the sport, and we're seeing POW make great headway to sort of continue to make this link between athletes and climate activism. And so 86% of our respondents also agreed that sports holds responsibility for action. And you can see in that table there, they had to rank them in terms of who is most responsible. And it was the international sporting organizations that these athletes and coaches felt like was the most important avenue to pursue climate action. In sort of the study itself details a lot more quotes, so we did follow-up interviews with several of these athletes and coaches, and it very much aligns to what Auden was telling us this morning, which is that it's deeply uncomfortable for a lot of athletes and coaches to be in the spotlight and to be engaging in policy, because you very much can get this polarizing idea of whether or not athletes should or shouldn't be engaging in politics. And so you sort of see this challenge of these athletes wanting to engage, but certainly sort of a bit of angst around doing so. So similarly here, this was us asking them what their thresholds were for in terms of how do we deem conditions being fair or unsafe. And so this is what was entered into the climate analysis that Robert presented on in terms of when we looked at the viability of future host cities. We based it off of these athlete thresholds. So when they deemed, for example, temperatures to be too warm, at which point it would become unsafe or unfair. But you do see slight variability across disciplines. So understandably, the alpine skiers are the most sensitive to warming temperatures compared to some of the other disciplines. So we also looked at other key sort of climate change adaptation mechanisms that have been put in place to successfully host the games, success being defined by the IOC as being able to run all the competitions with minimal delays within their 2-week time period. And so we asked them, sort of based off what we know of how the games have adapted to weather to date, which ones are they most uncomfortable with in terms of adaptation. So you can see sort of artificial surfaces as being sort of the least acceptable, but wet snow, narrow snow coverage, thin snow coverage, rain, wind, and fog also sort of all being really big concerns with respect to the games being safe and or fair. So in this slide, it ties well to, if you think about what Robert predominantly has led versus what I have predominantly led with respect to whether we're looking at climate change risks as it impacts from a ski industry or an operation side, which is all in blue. And then what I do is predominantly green. How do skiers respond? If we're actually to get a true best chance at trying to project what the ski industry might do, the reality is we need to couple these things. Like, operators are not going to adapt in isolation to skiers and how they adapt. We need to be understanding sort of the synchronous evolution together. And so when we think about understanding the demand response of skiers, it's predominantly been through surveys. And while for elite level athletes, it might be easier for them to conceptualize environmental change, it's a lot harder for the general public. We know this to be true. The general public has a hard time making the connection between climate change and environmental change and what that might look like. So if we were to ask skiers, how much is too much crowding? How narrow is too narrow for a ski run? That's really difficult to sort of grasp that in a survey. So we're looking to use virtual reality as a way that we can allow skiers to sort of have an immersive environment where they can visually see what narrow slopes might look like, what overcrowding might look like, and then have those respondents who are experiencing this virtual environment to identify sort of what their thresholds might be based off these visualizations. And so that's what Mabe's really been working on through her sort of graduate studies, is pairing this VR approach through a skier survey so that we can better sort of create these system-based approaches. And these integrated assessments are still very novel. There aren't very many that have been done. We've done one in Ontario as a team, and we have another one coming up in the US, but there's still a lot of pieces that go into sort of creating these system-based models, but I think it's the sort of best way forward. So as I said, sort of VR survey respondents don't always align with behavior. So what people say they'll do on a survey is not necessarily what they do in real life. And so VR might help us sort of narrow that perception gap. And climate change and its associated impacts are difficult to visualize. So how skiers perceive crowding, how they perceive thin snow coverage or narrow snow coverage, VR can help us sort of better assess sort of how skiers perceive and then therefore might respond to these changing environmental conditions. So with that, I again apologize for the delayed start, but I appreciate your time and welcome any questions you might have.
So I found your conversation about sort of substitutions, whether they're spatial, temporal, or what was the other one? Activity. Really interesting. And I was wondering, I guess a little bit how you model that. Do you look at past behavior or sort of very recent behavior? Sort of my research as a historian suggests that that's what you said reflects what I'm finding qualitatively, but you know, I couldn't make a graph to save my life. What is the extent to be able to graph back, or have you sort of graph model back, or have you done that? Sort of, yeah.
Yeah, so as I said, there are very few studies that have been done that have actually surveyed how skiers will respond. And there's also been very, very limited research that's looked at how skiers have responded in record warm conditions. So in terms of how we would model that, one of the challenges and also sometimes a limitation is how the question is asked. So we know that as people, we have a hard time remembering what we did. And as people, we have a hard time imagining what we will do. So sort of the ideal, sort of from like a research methodological standpoint, sort of the ideal thing is if you can capture either what people did do. So looking at historic responses of how people, so for example, looking at lift ticket sales, oftentimes researchers such as myself, we don't have access to that type of data. So that's where I'm sure the industry probably knows what's going on a lot more than we as academics know. And in an ideal world, we would have access to that data. But that's sort of the richest data set you can get, is how did people actually respond when the conditions were happening at the time. And then what we know in terms of thinking about climate change surveys is asking people to think in the future, if this ski resort were to close because of climate change, what would you do? Sort of this cognitive dissonance starts to happen where it's like, well, I don't think that's going to happen, so I'm not going to answer that way. And so you sort of try to ask respondents a way of like, if it wasn't open today, what would you do? And you don't put a climate context on it. So yeah, it's a little bit of sort of trickery that sort of has to go behind the scenes in terms of how you would ask it. But yeah, there's very little research actually being done right now.
It actually surprises your data, because the age group that would be most inclined to give up skiing is the one, where was it, 24 to 34. It stood out a little bit among
Yeah, the ones who are most likely to give up the sport in terms of an activity substitution was our oldest age group, was 65 plus. The sort of middle ages, they were similar in terms of spatial or temporal substitution. And from an industry perspective, it doesn't matter as much. Well, let me rephrase that. As an industry, if you think of it sort of on a grand scale, it doesn't matter so much if you have skiers sort of shifting the timing or location. That obviously has greater implications for an individual ski resort, especially if you're the one where they're opting out of your resort to travel somewhere else.
I want to remind people following in remote that you can ask questions. Yep, Kenna.
I have a question. Speaking of cognitive dissonance, in Colorado, you probably know the competition here is who can open their resort sooner, the soonest, which means a lot of snowmaking happens. And if you're saying that I'm understanding from your research, we really want to kind of get the thought process around whether that is a good thing to be doing or not. So how do we justify or rectify those two things?
How? I'm not sure. I think Auden is a lot more inspirational and sort of motivating us all in terms of what we should do. I think in large part, it's starting to be honest about asking the question. So like, I would love for the media to stop talking about the ski industry is doomed, because I personally just don't believe that to be true. I'd rather them be talking about, should we be making snow in the desert? Should we be rushing to open the industry? Should we be aiming to have this sort of 100-day ski season? I think, yeah, so I think it's almost like we need a research shift in terms of how we think of impacts. I think we need almost like this social shift to be thinking more critically about what we're doing and why, as opposed to can we do it?
Yep, Robert.
So question for you is, I noticed that you have, with the warming temperatures and the limited snow conditions, how much is that affecting new people coming into the sport?
Yeah, so I think that's a really important research area, is to really look at that beginner market, because we know if we know that the most resilient skiers, meaning those who are most willing to continue skiing even when the conditions aren't optimal, we know it's those who are really loyal to the sport, who have been skiing for a long time, who deem themselves to be expert skiers. And so I think one of sort of the big questions, again, not being openly talked about, I think on the industry side, they're aware of it and they're talking about it, is just what happens to that beginner market. And people learn to ski at these smaller resorts, and then that's how they sort of get ingrained in the sport. And then they'll move up into these other resorts who sort of can afford to be climatically viable, or can afford to have a diversification of activities at the resort. So I think we need more research and more attention into how sort of these beginner skiers might respond. And I do hope that sort of this idea of virtual reality could help, because I think in that sort of younger market, or those that don't have a really sort of years of experience behind them, to say, oh, the ski slope, the snow on the run is going to get more narrow, they might not really know what that means or what that looks like. And so in part, I hope VR helps us sort of maybe get at some of those beginner markets, and potentially VR can be used as a way to understand even skiers who aren't currently in the market. So obviously the industry wants to be recruiting more people into the sport, and their VR is being used in other sports contexts to build enthusiasm around it. And so I think there's potentially something in a VR context also to recruit.
All right, and we have a question from CB Bechtel, who is the executive director of Team Summit in Summit County. Any thoughts on shifting seasons? In the Central Rockies is getting increasingly difficult to open in October, November, but most resorts close in mid-April. But May is becoming increasingly snowy. I personally do think this is the way forward, but up to you.
Yeah, I think as I said, we see that skiers are really resilient. And so at this point, how we're seeing sort of how skiers are responding, even if the season's getting shorter, it doesn't necessarily limit the amount they're skiing. So if, for example, you have a skier that goes 10 times per year, and normally that's between November and April, they're still going 10 times, they're just going in that shortened season. So as of right now, we're seeing that skiers will continue to sort of behave the same in terms of their participation in the sport. But what we really don't know is if that's sustainable. People might be willing to do that now, but maybe year after year, they might get tired of that commitment and of sort of putting it all into a shorter season. We don't know at this point.
Yep, Jesse.
I don't know if you have any sense of this, but is there a relationship between sort of the distance of mountains from places or the easy access and the resilience, right? I mean, a lot of us are academics. I ski when I don't have to, and I live in Texas. I ski when I have breaks, and if there's no snow in December, I'm not skiing very much that season. So I'm just wondering if you've seen any correlation or.
Yeah, and I mean, you spoke to it in your presentation too, that sort of winter season is really critical for ski resorts, that winter, so the holiday season sort of being that week between Christmas and New Year's Eve, that is financially a critical moment for the industry. It's also why we see making so intensely at the beginning to ensure that they are open, because ultimately that is where people have the most amount of free time. So yeah, there definitely is a concern that if we can't be open for holidays when we know people have free time to be engaging in the sport, over time, do you potentially lose that market altogether, especially with the younger generations? Like if that's not a tradition to always go, for example, on that sort of Christmas holiday break, then it's not something you continue into your adulthood.
Jill, and
Yeah,
but
Stevie has a really good point. Some of us who live and work in the mountains, we've noticed, especially over the last few years, it's perfect skiing in April and May, and the ski areas are closed. And it's terrible right now because the ski areas are pretty limited. So a shifting of that thought pattern, marketing seems like, all right, everybody wants to play golf, they want to go to the lake, or they don't want to ski anymore, and it's perfect.
we actually very much enjoy the empty slopes in April and May. It's the best part of the season. Yeah. Jill? Jill?
So I had a question. What is your opinion on the snowless learner type environments? There are some in Denver and in LA where you have a massive roller that just is almost a continuous slope that people learn on. Do you think that can have any impact on beginners getting into the sport compared to learning on real snow?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any like industry stats or intel in that space, but I know the same thing. Virtual reality is like another sort of similar angle of how can we get beginners into the sport sort of off the hill and try to entice them onto the hill. But I don't know what the uptake is on that in terms of how successful that has been as a recruitment strategy.
And for the record, my best part of the season is May and June and Monmouth. And this year was outstanding. No, but you are completely right. I mean, the cycle will need to shift. And one way to shift it is also shifting the competition, which the problem is in Europe starts very early. So here we feel compelled to start also very early. Otherwise, Europe catches ahead. And again, it starts with FIS, the World Cup, because the World Cup started in October. It's totally crazy. Goggia was complaining about it, that the races that in the end didn't take place in Cervinia prevented them to come and train in Koper, which is what they usually do before the season starts. So again, it needs to start from the International Federation. Now, thank you very much.